Hey, I'm David, and I am helping to answer some questions that students have had. This question is how/where do I start if I want to study the Bible? First off, this is a great question because it shows a desire and a willingness to get to know God better through His Word. God gave us His Word exactly what He wanted us to hear and wanted us to have today is given us to us in the Bible. It was God inspiring human authors to write down different things. And so there's 66 different parts to the Bible, right? Some are letters that were written from one person to a church or one person to another. Some are like poetry. Some are more traditional, like books, as you would think of them. Some are historical books, like giving you exact kind of details of things. Some are like narrative books, like telling a story about a person or event or people. And so there's 66 books, if you will. And then there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Old Testament is a story of the nation of Israel, right? The people that God chose to be kind of like His witnesses to the world before Jesus. It's telling this story of them before Jesus came to earth. And so it's giving kind of the whole backstory there. It gives you the account of creation, and then God forming His people, leading them out of slavery, leading them through all these different kings and crazy stuff, and lots of interesting stories back there. It gives you really the backstory that you need to be able to understand to really fully appreciate the Jesus story, which comes then in the New Testament. We see the story of Jesus, of His life, His death, His resurrection, and then of how His church sprang up after His resurrection, and details all that stuff. So that's kind of what the Bible is, right? Lots of different genres within it, lots of interesting things all throughout. The Gospels are where I would encourage you to start. If you're just getting into reading the Bible, studying it, I would encourage you to start with the Gospels. The Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are 4 different accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And so these are, they're like eyewitness stories, right? So imagine you witness a car crash, right? And the police come and they get 4 different witnesses to tell about what happened at this car crash. Well, that's kind of what happens in the Gospels, is we get to see 4 different eyewitnesses give their account of what happened. And so each of these human authors who were eyewitnesses, or at least had talked to eyewitnesses, in the case of Luke, he didn't actually meet Jesus per se, but he got lots of he gathered a bunch of stories together about Jesus and did a lot of research when writing his. But John was a disciple and follower of Jesus. Matthew was a disciple and follower of Jesus. And Mark was probably around Jesus, and he was really mentored by Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, and really probably gives Peter's account or eyewitness story. So the Gospels give 4 different eyewitness stories about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which means that they're not all going to be word for word the exact same, which is really a good thing if you think about it, because if they were all word for word the exact same, it'd be kind of not that it'd be boring, but it'd be kind of pointless to have 4 different ones in there that are saying the exact same thing. Now they're all saying the same overall thing, right? Jesus came, He lived a perfect life, He died for our sins, He rose from the dead. But each one gives kind of a different perspective on that. Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience, whereas Luke was writing to more of a Gentile audience, most likely. So there's different perspectives in there that they kind of give, and you'll get to see that a little bit if you read them all. I would encourage, if you're looking for one in particular to start with, I would encourage the Gospel of John. That's the one that most people will encourage you to start with, is the Gospel of John. I think it pretty well articulates the whole Jesus story. John's Gospel was most likely written last, so he kind of came in and offers some other perspective maybe that wasn't captured in the first 3 Gospels. He also gives kind of a good insight into creation and just the beginning of things and how Jesus was there from the beginning. That's how he kicks it off. It's a beautiful passage in John 1. So I would start with John. That would be the first place I would go. Then I would go to Acts, which is just kind of an account of the history of the early church, how it went from scared people who had kind of quit following Jesus when he died to once he rose and they saw him again, how then the church just exploded after that. The church was started and exploded and went all over the world. So that's pretty cool to read about. And then Romans is Paul's letter to the church in Rome, and it's very just theologically rich, which gives you a lot to know about God and about salvation. Many of the passages that we'll quote about salvation come to us from Romans. I think it's just a great place to a lot there in a book or a letter. So those are kind of the three I would start with is John, then Acts, and then Romans. Eventually, you're going to want to get to the other letters that Paul and other early pastors wrote. You're going to want to go back to the Old Testament, the Genesis story, all that stuff, so you can get the backstory on how Jesus, how everything was set up for Jesus. But that's where I would start. Some practical things that you can do. Always make sure you're reading in context. This is key. Read it in context, the verse. Don't just take a verse and read just a verse. Read that verse within the context or the larger passage it's in. So read it within the chapter that it's in. Read it within the overall letter or book that it's in. Understand that it's not just meant to be just some quotable that you can just pull out. No, you got to understand that this was something written by, let's take Romans, for example. Romans is a letter written by Paul to the church in Rome, and he would have written it as one cohesive letter. So we need to take it all in context with each other, not just ripping things out of context. So context is key. Get to know the context of what you're reading. So just start with, don't just read a single verse. Read more than that. Read what's around it, the verses before it, the verses after. Read the whole chapter if you can. Read the whole book if you can, or the whole letter. And then as you can, try to think about what was their context. What was the writer's context and what was the audience he was writing to? What was their context? When you can get to know those things, that'll help you a long way. Because if we just read it with our own eyes and think, how does this apply to my life today, before we think about how would this have applied to them, or what does it mean? We can read a whole lot of things into it that never were meant to be there. So those are some starters. Read it in context. I would say read it with other people if you can. Ask for help if you get stuck. Set manageable expectations for yourself of if it's 3 days a week, great. If it's 5 days a week, great. Set a goal that's manageable for yourself. And then start with the Gospels, John, and go from there. Thanks, guys.